Hey y'all, we're Group 7C, Amber Carpio, Eric Morris, Carlos Salamanca, and Tristan Young. In this video, we'll cover the second half of our History of Engineering course. Tristan will discuss managers, workers, and bosses in the early 20th century. Eric will cover engineering and the military during the Cold War, and Amber will finish off with a discussion over the politics of algorithms in the present day. Tristan, take us away.
In Module 4, we observe the corporatization of engineering work. Corporations begin to form as engineering projects become more large scale and very complex. Engineers go into management more often as they are seen as a technical person that might be able to guide the project a little bit better. We can see this as a focal point in the module with Frederick Taylor and his scientific management theory. Often this theory takes away some of the power from the workers by routinizing certain events as events unfold. This is to hopefully increase the profit for both the employer as well as the employee, but ends up removing some of their work satisfaction. This is also a very interesting point as this is very unique to engineers out of the STEM field or other professionals such as lawyers and doctors, as they are more likely to go into management than to stay in their own profession. Another focal point of Module 4 is looking at the Great Depression and going into the politics of engineering and how it's affecting some more than others. This is very evident when we observe Herbert Hoover, and he tries to implement a technocracy, or maybe, I guess you could say like a scientific management kind of system on the economy and the U.S. as a whole, and it ends up not working out very well. It could have been unfortunate timing, but more than likely it was because it just wasn't the right fix for the situation, as it abstracted away the humanity of subordinates too much at the time. And we can see here, this is another political cartoon of how technocracy was left behind. And a lot of reasons why it was left behind as well is it was hard to implement. Like, it's a good idea in theory, but it might not have worked out as well.
Thanks, Tristan. My name's Eric, and I will be discussing Module 5, which is Engineering and the Military. Engineering in the military is split up into 4 phases. The first phase of the military's influence on engineering is obviously starting at West Point, as we learned, and with the Army Corps of Engineers. Also, a big influence was interchangeable gun parts and the manufacturing that went along with it. As time moves on, the military's influence is diminished due to the rise of land-grant colleges and the individual industry. Next is the World Wars involving more state-sponsored research and engineering. And finally, the increase in spending during the Cold War, which helped to fund various projects for the gain of the military and the universities. As we know, the Cold War was really just a huge show of force to mainly the Soviets. Whether it is the space race or the nuclear arms race, during this time, the world was in a competitive state and kind of on the edge. It was a huge decision to make for smaller countries to side with capitalism or communism. While there are many accomplishments in the Cold War, the most significant is probably the tearing down of the Berlin Wall and the disbandment of the Soviet Union. Some of the big things engineering-wise to come from the Cold War and the massive funding were intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear power, the Atlas rockets, improved aircraft, and better telecommunications and satellites. All of those things are still pretty prevalent today. While the Cold War brought out a lot of good from universities and engineers, some of the consequences or downfalls were projects not producing the product they were tasked with fast enough. That might be because the rapid pace at which things became obsolete during the time. An example was the flaws in the SAGE project's radars. Now, I'm going to pass it over to Amber, who's going to talk about Module 6.
Thank you, Eric. In Module 6, I'm going to discuss the politics of algorithms, the unequal role of women and minorities, and the environmental consequences of ICT. Algorithms are very powerful. In fact, they shape what information you find, whether you're eligible for certain services, or even if you're approved for loans. They have many characteristics such as being private, commercial, and often they're predominantly designed by white male engineers. Many algorithms are known for their bias. In fact, they favor consumers over citizens. A lot of them enable the powerful to become more powerful. One example is self-driving cars and drones. These self-driving cars and drones are known to intentionally replace jobs of middle-class drivers, and these companies are intentionally doing this for the benefit of their company. Moving on to the unequal role of women and minorities in engineering. There was no access to engineering programs due to race and gender, less funding for schools and minorities, social pressure for women not being ladylike. A lot of these struggles created the pathway for women and minorities in engineering. In fact, we have two examples: the civil rights era, which we have Martin Luther King Jr., and the push for full voting rights for African Americans, less discrimination, and better jobs. And we also have the women's rights movements. Now, the positives of these are barrier to education was eliminated, and corporations start to take diversity more seriously when hiring. Finally, moving on to the environmental consequences of ICT. ICT involves material impacts with energy consumptions and e-waste being the most significant costs. Blockchains, which are used with Bitcoin, those algorithms have a large environmental impact. And even the farms of servers are harmful for the environment rather than beneficial.
Thanks, Amber. While the first half of the course covered the origins of American engineering in the 18th and 19th centuries, the second half of the course shows how these roots give birth to a distinctly American school of engineering in the 20th century. The role of the engineer in American corporations would go on to influence management strategies in nearly every single economic industry in the United States and beyond. The establishment of the military-industrial university complex during the Cold War would go on to influence the careers of a vast majority of American engineers from the 1960s to the present. Lastly, the ubiquity of the computer processor presents a relatively young class of computer and software engineers with a set of promising, if daunting, tasks regarding the role of the computer in society. Meanwhile, although women and people of color remain largely underrepresented in the engineering industry, they nonetheless represent a majority of those scholars who dare question the universality and lack of bias traditionally associated with computing systems in favor of more equitable models and algorithms.